Welcome everyone to this week's video. Today we are on Fish Friday number 282 and we have a good one for you today. Today's Fish Friday, I'm going to talk a little bit about fish physiology, and I do not mean this to be any disrespect or make light of any of the situation that has gone on in recent weeks, but something that often gets asked is how do fish survive cold or freezing temperatures? So I thought it would be really neat to do just a video on how fish survive cold and freezing temperatures. Now, it's important to remember that most fish are ectothermic, meaning their body temperature matches the water around them. This is also the proper scientific term for cold-blooded. So ectothermic organisms get their body heat from the surrounding environment. So in a fish's case, water. So when extreme cold does hit, the fish have to survive that. And they do not generate body heat most of the time. So how do they survive? Well, they actually survive through a combination of physics, behavior, and physiology. And it's important to note that cold itself is rarely the killer of fish. Usually it's more rapid temperature change and oxygen loss are what truly threaten fish during cold temperatures, especially during these winter months. Now, what I mean by the physics is water behaves in kind of a weird way that if it did not operate in this way, fish life would not exist. At all. Water behaves in a way that actually protects aquatic life. Water is densest at 4 degrees Celsius, which is around 39 degrees Fahrenheit. And colder water, and when you get colder than that, it actually becomes less dense. This is why ice floats. So what happens is the water gets dense at the top and it starts sinking until it reaches 4 degrees Celsius or 39 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it goes back up to the top. And that means that the coldest water is always going to be on top of the warmer water. So that is why ice will form at the surface of a pond or a lake, not at the bottom. So because of that very crucial physics fact, lakes and rivers and coastal waters, they can freeze completely over, but liquid water remains below. And it's usually at actually a very relatively stable temperature just above freezing. So as long as the water doesn't completely freeze solid, which has happened in the past, fish can actually survive these extreme winter conditions. And this is how that terminology, that physics actually applies across freshwater and saltwater systems alike. So the physics of water actually does most of the heavy lifting on why fish can actually survive colder temperatures. Now, they do have some physiological changes as well. So when temperatures drop, most fish respond the same way. Their metabolism will really slow, their movement will completely decrease, and their feeding will essentially stop. They're getting cold, so they're just not moving around as well. The fish will actually sink usually into deeper water. They'll find shelter, and just really they'll find areas where the temperature changes much more slowly, because when fish try to survive the winter, it's not about strength or movement. It's really more often than not about conserving energy and avoiding stress. So finding a nice quiet spot and just holding up for the entire winter. Almost kind of like an estivation sort of style. So that's that was more of like behavioral change. The actual physiological changes they make kind of ties into more of the metabolism dropping. Their heart rate will go to extremely low, oxygen demand on the body drops, and something that's very interesting is that the cell membranes will actually adjust to remain flexible in colder water. So they're adjusting their internal body to actually adjust to the cold temperature. So a combination of the water physics, their behavioral changes and physiological changes make it to where they can survive for this. And that's usually enough for most fish. And when I say most fish, I'm meaning the vast majority on fish, that's all they need to survive these colder temperatures. However, there's obviously some other spots in the world that are constantly cold, and so there are some fish species that go much further. And obviously I'm talking about like the polar and subpolar waters, so all those areas near the Arctic and the Antarctic. And something that's very interesting, and we've talked about some of this in the past, is that these fish will actually produce antifreeze protein. So they will actually create a chemical in their body that's similar to antifreeze that will keep them from essentially freezing to death. And these little tiny proteins, these little compounds, will attach to ice crystals in the blood and bodily fluids, preventing ice crystals from growing large enough to cause damage. Because it's important to note that when ice is causing damage, when people die from cold, or not people, but when fish are dying from cold, it's usually not the cold itself. It's because as water becomes ice, or any liquid becomes ice, it expands. So if you let that ice completely expand, it's going to usually cause cellular damage because the liquid inside the cells are actually bursting. But so these antifreeze proteins are binding to all the little tiny ice crystals that are forming, but it keeps them from actually growing large enough to cause damage. And something interesting, in fact, it's kind of like the interesting fact we're not gonna end the video on, but the interesting fact that we're just gonna put in the middle is that the discovery of those antifreeze proteins that these fish use was completely unexpected. In the mid 20th century, scientists were studying the ocean pout, which is here. Scientists were studying the ocean pout and Zoarces americanus, I believe, and they noticed that something strange, because based on our knowledge of chemistry at the time, the fish's blood should have frozen solid, because the waters where it actually just was at freezing, even at that depth. Yes, even though it was still liquid water, it still should have been so cold that this animal should have froze. So scientists kind of embarked on a mission. Why is this fish alive? And so when they analyzed the blood, they found the specialized proteins that attached directly to the ice crystals, preventing the crystal growth, and it allowed the bodily fluids to remain liquid. And it was actually the first documented case of biological antifreeze in a vertebrate. And it actually just completely transformed our understanding of cold tolerance and, how fish species example. And it led to finding antifreeze proteins in a ton of other species. It's much more common than you might think. Much more common. Some examples of this would be like the notothenoids, which often live in water that are even colder than 0 degrees Celsius, around -2 degrees Celsius, which I believe is around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The notothenoids in the Antarctic ice fish live in some of the coldest waters ever recorded. Another one is the Arctic cod, which this is actually a much more common species that a lot of people will eat cod, but these cod live in colder waters, and they actually do produce these antifreeze proteins as well, which is and it's very important, because otherwise this fish species probably wouldn't exist. Obviously we talked about the ocean pout, which is, a very important species because it revealed the antifreeze proteins. Something I did want to bring up is it's not just saltwater fish that do that. There is the rainbow smelt, which is actually a freshwater example of a fish that produces antifreeze compounds. I should mention though that the antifreeze compounds are much more common in saltwater fish than in freshwater fish, because freshwater fish usually are going to have much warmer waters around them because they have the surrounding land actually helping warm their waters. And so these are fish species that have these antifreeze proteins, and they do a lot of it. These proteins are being studied very in depth to be used for medicine, cryopreservation, and cold resistant crops. Now, I said most fish survive by changing their behavior, physiological changes, and things like this. However, there are some fish that break the rule. While most fish survive the cold by slowing down, there's a few fish out there that just completely take a different approach. And that would be things like the tuna. The tuna are actually endothermic species, a group, or at least partially endothermic. They actually just maintain body temperatures inside of the cell, so they're more of what you would call a warm-blooded organism, and they do that by actually just having a high enough metabolism that it allows them to keep doing it. But one of the things the reason why tuna and sharks and dolphins and whales and seals can survive in these types of environments is something called a countercurrent heat exchange sort of pattern. So the warm blood in the center of the body, in the muscles and things like this, it's very hot. But obviously you have these fins, and this is especially true in like dolphins and seals. You have those fins that they're still going to have blood flow to them. Well, as soon as that blood gets to the tip of the fin, this water, being 2 degrees Celsius, it's going to be incredibly cold, which would cause them to lose so much body heat so fast. So the warm blood actually transfers heat before it even goes out of there, because the blood doesn't need the heat. The blood is transferring the oxygen, not necessarily the heat. So at the base of the fins, especially in dolphins and seals, is a web of capillaries, which capillaries are extremely tiny, thin blood vessels. And the heat is actually transferred across that bed of capillaries to where, so you have hot blood coming from the body, it transfers the heat into where once it passes that, it's just warm blood. But when it circulates back, it's already lost its heat, and so it's very cold blood. But because some heat is being transferred, it's entering back into the body as cool blood, is a way to think about it. And actually, here, there we go. I'm sorry, I have a bad keyboard. I gotta get it. Oh no. Oh no, technical difficulties. So sorry. I'm so sorry about this. Okay, here you go. Here's a good example. So the blood coming from the heart from the inside has heart from the gills, and it goes out, and it's transferring heat. So imagine if there was a web of capillaries right there that are allowing them to do it. And this is actually very prevalent across a ton of animal species, birds, small rodents, and things like that. Anything to keep you from losing body heat to the outside environment. It's a very important adaptation. So that is actually how these larger fish species and the aquatic mammals can actually survive in the ocean. And actually, it's how mammals can survive in the ocean to begin with, because the ocean is already going to be colder than most warm-blooded animals can take. So when does cold actually become lethal? It becomes lethal when the shallower waters are completely frozen solid, or when ice actually causes a thick enough sheet and stays there long enough that it prevents oxygen from coming back into the system, because these animals are still producing carbon dioxide like we do. And what a lot of people don't realize is most of the oxygen that comes into the water happens at the surface. So if that cold water does not have enough gap, or it stays locked in that ice for too long, you'll actually cause an oxygen depletion so much that it actually kills the fish. So that is why these extreme quick cold snaps are actually much more dangerous for fish and aquatic organisms than just general, going from fall to winter back to spring. So the important takeaway from all this is fish don't survive winter or extreme cold snaps by fighting the cold. They survive by just slowing their life down, finding a very stable, secure environment, and then just waiting it out, essentially. Very, very neat thing, and I thought it would be very relevant. Again, I do not want to make light of the very serious winter storm that happened across the United States. However, I thought that it would be a very good educational tool to teach people how fish survive the cold. But thank you guys so much again. I really appreciate it. Hope to see you again. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe if you do. I'd really appreciate it. Hope to see you again. If you'd like to support the channel, please click the link down below. It is by no means expected, but very much appreciated regardless. Take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and